Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of JTV. So I want to do something a little bit different today, which is to respond to a video interview that I saw recently, which was a discussion between two very famous and well-known comedians, Russell Brand and Ricky Gervais. They were discussing atheism, God, religion, spirituality, and Ricky Gervais' approach to religion and spirituality I've found very difficult to listen to without wanting to really kind of respond to him, have a conversation with him, because I feel like there's some level of shallowness from his perspective in talking about the subject, and happens to be I really like him. If you ask any of my close friends or relatives and you ask them who's Ollie's favourite comedian, they will say Ricky Gervais. I loved him, especially when growing up, The Office, Extras, all that stuff I found extremely fun, entertaining, hilarious. So I think as a comedian, he's brilliant, and I really like his stuff. But I feel on religion and atheism and his view on spirituality and God, it's something I've really wanted to have a conversation with him about. And seeing as I think the chance of that are quite low, I don't know, perhaps maybe he might see this one day. But in the meantime, at least, I want to respond to some of the things that he said to have a bit of a follow-up to the kind of comments that he makes. And also perhaps give you guys, as viewers, some interesting responses that I've learned over time to some of the key arguments made by modern atheists today. So let's have a look at some of the things he said in this conversation. By the way, Russell Brand, I don't think he made a lot of the arguments that I would want to make in response to Ricky Gervais, but it happens to be he seems a lot more open to the concept of spirituality, at least not organised religion as he would call it, but definitely spirituality. And I'm going to be talking about this obviously from a Orthodox Jewish perspective in terms of how the arguments that I'm going to put across and make, because I buy into that system. I think it's coherent, makes sense to me. So that's going to be where I'm coming from. And yeah, as I say, Russell Brand, I think he seems to be more open to this. I think he's, seems like a fairly decent guy, deep guy. Happens to be some of his opinions that I've heard about Israel seem a little bit morally perverse to me, in terms of he was talking about, I remember him doing a video a few years ago about Hamas and Israel and saying, Hamas, they just did like a little rocket, is kind of how he pulled it. And then Israel's way too disproportionate is in their response.
Like if I sort of beating up someone with a variety of weaponry and they're jabbing me with a pin, it's like, the pin technique, you're an animal. That's the only thing they have in order to defend you.
The moral equivocation, all that kind of stuff between a terrorist organisation and a democratic nation seemed to me just absurd. But let's just put that to one side for now, and let's watch the video, and I'm going to sort of stop it through different parts and tell you what I would say in response. So let's just start going. And I've picked out quite a lot of what Ricky said. It was an hour-long conversation, although the religion stuff was only sort of towards the latter half. But I've picked out some different stuff that he said, and let's just have a look at it and see what we find. So let's go.
We're just part of nature. We're not above it. We're nothing special. We're not as important as bees. We're not as important as bees, right? Let's let that sink in, But
okay, fine, Ricky. So Ricky's saying we're not as important as bees. Ricky, I'd like to ask you something. If you were on a boat and you had on the boat with you, let's say a stranger and your dog, they both fall into the sea and they're both drowning, who would you want to save first? I mean, it could be, by the way, that you would say my dog first. I'd want to save my dog first. And I think there are plenty of people that do say this. I would hope a lot of our viewers would feel quite clear that the first being that you save first is the human being. And I think most people kind of know that human beings, their lives have higher value than animal lives do. It sounds like you might dispute that, but I feel like deep down you recognise that when it comes to, maybe I just doubt I don't think you're a vegetarian, so you probably eat animals, and I assume you'd say it's not okay to do that with human beings. So why? Why is that the case, Ricky? Some people argue, some atheists I've heard argue, well, human life is more precious because human beings have a higher consciousness. What if you had someone that's very unlikely to come out of a coma? Is their life if their consciousness is shut off, is their life still valuable, still meaningful? Most people would say you shouldn't shut off the life-supporting machines. I think otherwise I don't think most people want to be friends with you or let you make government decisions, or if you really think that animals and human beings have the same level of value. You said we're nothing special. I think deep down we all know that human beings have a higher value of life, but the question is why? I think we instinctively know it. It also happens to be that monotheism, the main great monotheistic religions, tell us that that's the case, that human beings, unlike animals, have a divine spark within them, which gives them a sense of connection to the infinite, and therefore they have infinite value. Religion tells us that's important, and I think it's a very important place to be, to value human life higher. And you're right, actually, that according to atheistic logic, yeah, human beings and animals have the same value. But we instinctively know that that's not true, and I think you enter a very dangerous world when we start to say that we have the same value as ants, And I don't think you're vegetarian. You might be, but I don't think you are. And therefore, how does that make sense if we're the same as animals? Why is it okay to kill animals but not human beings? Let's keep going.
Then there's people in denial. There's lots of propaganda out there why it's okay, why bullfighting's okay, because it's an honourable way for the bull to die. Shut up, because it's tradition. Well, so was slavery and child sacrifice. It's culture. It's not culture, right? It's like what? I don't get it. I don't.
Yes, Ricky, I think you're right, that sometimes cultures can justify the most terrible, appalling things. Look only in the 20th century and look at some of the societies, cultures, the communists, the Nazis, who, by the way, often were secular societies and cultures that justified all kinds of terrible things. I don't think this is a question of religion or no religion that justifies, or in terms of who justifies good and bad, as in it's very, very clear cut between whether it's religion or not religion. But yes, absolutely, and this I think actually makes the case more boldly and clearly for why we need some kind of objective morality to adhere to. Otherwise, societies can justify all kinds of things. And I think we'll discuss this in a bit more depth as we keep going. So let's keep going.
Problems that we're experiencing in the world, like right across the scope of our conversation so far, whether it's people craving fame, adulation, celebrity approval, or people being cruel to animals, I reckon much of it can be derived from a sense of being separate from nature, whether that's inner nature or outer nature.
I'm actually not sure I'm going to agree with Russell Brand here when he says that us thinking that we're separate from nature is what leads to bad behaviour. In other words, thinking that we're a part and therefore we can dominate nature. I think you could argue it both ways. I think you could also say that if you think you're part of nature, then the laws of the jungle apply to you. Animals eat each other, protect themselves, and will act terribly towards other animals. And maybe you could say, well, maybe we should do the same. Let it be law of the jungle, basically. Let the strong dominate, and the weak will fall. That was, by the way, a certain despot's approach to building society. I think his name was Adolf Hitler. But he was very much about law of the jungle. So I don't think it's actually so clear-cut. I think you could argue both ways, that thinking we're separate from nature could make us behave bad towards animals and nature, or it could actually make us behave good towards nature. Because, again, if you think you're part of nature, you can act like all other animals and can be law of the jungle. If you think you're above nature or outside of nature, separate from nature, then it could make you think you actually have a responsibility. And certainly from the Torah, the Bible's perspective, man is created on the last day, once all of nature is created, to show man that yes, he's above nature in terms of his intrinsic value, having a soul that's godly, but also to teach man that he and she have a duty to behave morally because they have this godly soul, because that's what's expected of them, but also to treat nature in an appropriate and moral and just way, in a way that the rest of nature has no concern for. So actually, I think you can argue it both ways, and I'd probably say that by us believing that we are above nature and have higher morals to adhere to, doesn't always, but it should lead us to behaving better. So I think you could actually argue it the other way.
Like
I seem a spiritual person, but not literally, and that's totally true. I'm in as much awe at seeing a tree or a mountain or a bird or a river as anyone who thinks God made it. I see the beauty of nature, and I think most, and I don't know this, but you're right. There's a huge difference between spirituality. There's something to the self that gets you through, that you want to know the reason, you want to connect, all those things. I feel all those things without the belief in a God.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. The first point about gratitude, I'm sure you do have gratitude. That's great. It just happens to be when you add religion into the mix, it's gratitude towards a source of creation, whereas your source of creation is, as an atheist, is there is no source of creation. So it's just I suppose it's just an internal gratitude, but it's not to any being or anything. I think that's still great. Gratitude, certainly from a Jewish perspective, is considered essential to being happy and to leading a good life, actually, because you don't give if you're not grateful. And yeah, in terms of I don't need religion in order to feel spirituality, I think we need to get into definitions a little bit. What do you mean by spirituality? If you're saying there's nothing beyond the physical world, what do you actually mean when you say you experience this sense of oneness and connection and it being in awe? This kind of language, many people, everyone is able to experience at some point, and they feel a sense of going sort of beyond, a sense of oneness, a sense of going beyond, a sense of touching the infinite. And you're saying, well, I'm not feeling any sense of touching the infinite. I might feel it, but there is no transcendence beyond the physical world. And so it'd be good to clarify what you mean by that sense of spirituality. And I think it's an important question to ask. Why is this something that it's a bit, these feelings are a little bit intangible, and yet there's something that all human beings are able to experience, whether it's looking up at the stars or hearing a piece of music or looking someone in the eye and telling them that you love them. And many people feel like it is a transcendent experience. And the question is, well, why is that? Why do people feel that way? And then your second point, Ricky, which is that you said, well, you don't need religion for spirituality. Well, first of all, as I said, I don't know what you mean by spirituality if it's not transcending the physical world. But the question of why we need religion, in a sentence, religion is the purpose of it really is meant to be giving guidance for how to, number one, access that spirituality in the best way and lead the best life, give you guidance on that. It's not just necessarily inherent for people to realize the answers to all those things, but also it's, if you believe there is a source, a personal being that is the source of creation, I know you don't believe that, but we can talk about that a little bit later, but let's just say you do, then it makes sense that that being would give some kind of guidance, some kind of structure for how to develop the best possible relationship with this being. Some kind of book, some kind of holy book, some kind of direction. That's the point of religion, that's the point of Torah, at least in Judaism, and or whether it's holy books for other religions as well. Anyway, let's keep going. Religion
basically says, you want to get into heaven, I know him, you just got to do this for me, and we're called.
Well, actually, Ricky, I agree with you that when religion is about just, I'm just going to do all these things in order to get my place in heaven, I think that's very, very dangerous and certainly not the approach of Judaism. It's definitely worth, maybe we should put some links into in our video description where we have had some discussions with some rabbis about the question of, well, what should, if you base your religion and your morals on selfishness, really, which is I just going to get the best place in heaven, then yeah, that's a very, very bad way to live. That's another way of living a selfish life. And actually, that's the reason why you'll notice that in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, there is no mention of heaven. It doesn't say do this so you'll get a nice place in heaven. Very interesting. Why doesn't it do that? Because actually, in loving relationships, the place you really want to get to is loving someone or something because you love them, and doing a good thing because it's the right thing to do. It's right. Doing something right because it's right. That's considered the highest level to get to. And so yes, in the rabbinical writings, we talk about the concept of a heaven and an afterlife, absolutely. But in terms of the actual book, the codified laws for how to develop the best possible relationship, no, it doesn't mention reward, because that shouldn't be how we live. We should be giving to others and loving others because we love them. and because we love God and because it's right. So yes, that is a skewed view of religion. That's a skewed way in which, unfortunately, a lot of people practice their religion, but it's not the right way. So I agree with you on that.
And we know that everything that's ever started was written by usually a man with an agenda. It's no coincidence all those rules in the Old Testament sort of favour certain men. It's not a coincidence.
Ricky, actually, I don't really recognise what you're talking about when you describe the Bible this way. I think you should read a book by someone who we had on JTV a while back. In fact, I think for all the JTV videos I'm referencing, because it's so important, I'm going to put a bunch of links at the bottom of this video so you can watch them for anyone that's watching this video. But you should watch a video we did with a guy called Professor Joshua Berman, who published a book which was published by Oxford University called Created Equal: How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought. Actually, I think your whole reading of the Bible and saying it was written by a patriarchal system that was trying to preserve authority and power concentrated in a small elite, actually, I would say the Bible was a revolutionary document. Just think about the fact that it limits the power of the king and holds it to the rule of law. It separates powers from giving very specific roles to the kings, judges, the prophets, the priests, and separates them. It talks about the importance of social responsibility towards the poor and the needy, and that society shouldn't just be based around, elitism and class systems and preserving those things, which you saw in all kinds of, most, if not all, ancient societies and empires. I mean, think about the Exodus narrative itself, which is a narrative of a people who are a downtrodden, enslaved people escaping the tyranny of a king, Pharaoh, who had a great empire. I mean, this whole concept of this book being just maintaining the status quo, I just don't recognise that at all. And yes, I recognise there are some bits in the Torah which need a greater sense of understanding, whether it's the concept of an eye for an eye or the death penalty or those kind of things. But they need to be, these aren't straightforward issues. And again, we have plenty of content on that, and I'll put some links to that in the video description. Let's keep going.
And the same with, it's no coincidence that if you're born in America, you're probably Christian. If you're born in India, probably a Hindu, etc., etc. We know that.
Well, that's definitely true. That's definitely true that we are, as my rabbi used to say, 99% part of our society and 1% an individual. We're so massively affected by our society. But first of all, I could turn the tables and say that's the same with you, Ricky. I mean, yes, you'd say you were raised in a Christian home, but actually you live in a society in the UK which is largely, a huge swathe of the populace is atheist or doesn't subscribe to any form of organised religion. We're living in a secular, really atheist society. And so couldn't I say that you're the product of the society that you live in as well? It's definitely true. People are likely to, if they're unthinking, they'll just absorb the values of the country they're raised in or their parents that they're brought up in. It turns me personally, I've gone on a bit of a religious journey myself. I've become certainly a lot more observant than other members of my family and friends. But I just think that all you can really do is try the best you can to be as objective, as questioning as you can be, and have conversations based on that. I think that to try and second guess people and say, oh, well, you're only saying that because you were raised that way, I don't think that's really such a helpful way to go about having a discussion. Yes, you can make people realise the chances that they could be biased because of their backgrounds or whatever, and to challenge that. But other than that, let's just try and have a discussion based on ideas and speak within the realm of ideas and logic and challenge each other that way. So anyway, let's keep going.
And I think it was started with good intentions. In The Invention of Lying, when my character invents religion, he does it because he can't stand his mum's fear of death. And I remember when my mum was dying, if she asked me, I was thinking I was going to lie. I was like, yeah, there probably is. Because I probably would have. So
Okay, well, this now comes into the whole issue of, is religion a crutch for people? Is it something that people just seek for comfort even though there's no basis for it? This touches on something Karl Marx said, which is religion is the opiate of the masses. Well, again, I think this touches on the previous point, which is that let's not second guess why we're saying the things we do or why that we believe the things we do. Let's just have a discussion based on intellect and reason and logic. I don't think it's that helpful to talk about that. I'd also say that you could make just as strong a case that atheism is an emotional comfort and a crutch for people. I mean, yes, on the one hand, knowing that there's an afterlife and that there's a guide, there's a divine guide in your life, then yes, that's sort of comforting. But also at the same time, believing that there's ultimately no consequences to what you do, there's no ultimate accountability, no one's watching you 24/7, that also has its emotional attractiveness. So there's emotional attractiveness to both atheism and religion.
Technically, atheism doesn't even mean you don't believe in God. It means that you believe there's no God. It means that you just haven't found God yet. There's no evidence, and that is true. But it's core. And I've explained this many times that technically I'm an agnostic atheist because one deals with knowledge and one deals with belief. So no one knows. If we agree that no one knows, we're all atheists. So now, what do you think? And believers say, I think there is a God, and atheists think, I don't think there is a God because I haven't got any evidence yet. So that is all I'm saying.
Okay, so you're saying that you think atheism is dealing with knowledge and just lack of evidence in terms of a God, and religion is really about belief, despite there being no evidence. Well, I think that for some people, that's definitely what their belief in God is based on. They just say, well, I don't have evidence for it. It's a leap of faith, or that's faith means no evidence. That certainly isn't the Jewish perspective. The Jewish perspective is that you can have knowledge. There can, and that things can point towards there being a God. I would say actually at the moment, the things that we know about the universe, I think, point more towards an infinite creator, a non-physical creator, than the universe being an accident. And we'll talk about that as the video develops. But the basic reason why I think that is because many atheists were quite resistant to the Big Bang theory, the theory that the universe had a beginning. In the 1960s, this became the new sort of consensus and paradigm shift that occurred within the scientific world. And many people were resistant to that. They used to think the universe was eternal. The reason why they were resistant to that is because if the universe had a beginning, which is what is the consensus in the scientific community at the moment, because of the Big Bang was the beginning of time, space, matter, then another law of science which we observe is that every effect has a cause. So what was the cause for the effect of the Big Bang? And it surely holds that whatever caused the beginning of time, space, matter, finiteness has to be something that is outside of time, space, and matter, something non-finite, something infinite. So actually, many people recognize that monotheism is no longer such an absurd concept once you say that the universe had a beginning, because you need an infinite source to cause finiteness to begin if the universe had a beginning. So from that perspective, to say that I'm not dealing in the realms of evidence and rationality as a religious person, I think that's ridiculous. I don't think science has, discovered everything about the universe and what's happened and what's not happened. But I'm just saying, at this moment in time, to say that science contradicts the concept of an infinite being, an all-powerful being that's outside of time, space, and matter that caused the universe to begin, I think that's ridiculous. And we can talk about other elements as well of science, which we'll get to a little bit later. But I think that's a really important point to bear in mind. And I think a second really important point to bear in mind is that in Judaism, at least, faith, the word for faith is emunah, and it doesn't mean believing in something without any evidence, taking that leap of faith or blind faith, meaning you can't see any evidence in front of you. It means you can have evidence for God, But then the question is, faith is about, are you going to be loyal to that truth? You can know something is true and not believe and not adhere to the consequences of that reality, of that truth. I can know smoking is bad for me, but still choose to smoke every day. I don't smoke, by the way, but I could know smoking is bad for me and do it because, I have emotional, physical impulses that want me to do it, and I can somehow justify in my mind why I want to do it, but even though it doesn't really make so much rational sense. And or like if I'm on a diet and I know I mustn't have that muffin, but I do it anyway because of that wanting short-term pleasure. It's not just a matter of whatever you believe to be true, you will follow to that full extent. By the way, we're going to see how that's the case in your own philosophy, Ricky, when you talk about you don't think there's any objective morality, and yet the way you live, it appears to be as if you do recognise that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the point I'm getting at is that from a Jewish perspective at least, we don't believe that it's irrational to believe in a God. And there's also other reasons why we believe in God, and I'll put some links to those videos below, which explain why we think there's quite compelling evidence, whether it's the remarkable story of Jewish history chiming with how the Bible foresees Jewish history to unfold, even though it's such an unprecedented and unique way in which Jewish history manifested itself, or other such things. And that's a longer discussion. But certainly to say that science and the evidence contradicts the concept of God, I would actually say, well, I think that the fact the universe had a beginning and it requires an infinite being, something infinite, something outside of space, time, matter to create it, and also the fact that the universe, the incredible way in which it's so fitting for life, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I think it was Lawrence Krauss who wrote a book about something from nothing, that you can get something from nothing. It was really challenged by many of the academics in a peer review study on that book, because they're saying, number one, what he's talking about as being nothing, quantum fluctuations, is something. It's still within the realms of the physical universe. And secondly, trying to make an argument of something from nothing, it goes against everything we know about the universe, which is that every effect has a cause. So why are we suddenly trying to assume or find a way in which that principle doesn't work for the beginning of the universe? It seems to me like you're trying to just avoid the conclusion that there's something beyond this world, that beyond this universe, that caused the universe to begin. Anyway, let's keep going.
As you say, religion's something else to belief and spirituality.
Yes.
And
again, I think we've addressed this point. I don't know what he means by spirituality, if it's something that's not beyond the physical world. I'll explain why there is a necessity for religion, but we'll talk about that in a bit more depth later on.
And people even say to me, if someone proved there was a God, would you believe? I go, well, of course I would. It wouldn't even be belief, it would be knowledge. It would also be the greatest discovery ever. Let's cancel the Nobel site from now on. He's discovered God. It's done. And I think if that would change everything, I think. But until we know, I just don't. I don't want to live my life by a belief in something that I have no evidence in. That's all. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, well, I think we kind of discussed this earlier, which is that I think there are some clear pieces of evidence, pieces of the puzzle in terms of what science tells us about the universe that do point towards there being something beyond the physical world that I think you should acknowledge and have a discussion about, Ricky. You said, I would believe if it was clear as day to me, or if there was evidence or proof. As I say, I think there's lots of strong evidence. Do I believe there is absolute 100% proof of there being a God? Well, I don't even think I can prove 100% that I exist, that we exist, that there is existence. And I think that, at least from a Jewish perspective, we believe that as history, there were really two phases of history. The first phase, God was much more present and open, like the splitting of the sea and the 10 plagues and all that kind of stuff, miracles. And God wants to, from a Jewish perspective, wants to wean us off open miracles and seeing open miracles where he manifests himself to us sort of empirically with the naked eye, because it would, in a sense, limit our ability to really develop a trusting relationship with him. And again, that's not to say there isn't evidence today, that things that clearly point towards there being a God, but it does mean that God doesn't sort of appear to us in the sense of doing open miracles, things that override the laws of nature, because it gives us some room to learn how to build a trusting relationship with him when he's not visible with the naked eye. And it's considered an important way of developing a serious, meaningful relationship with our Creator, and that's the way he designed the world for us. So I recognise that that's a bit more nuanced an answer than just saying, well, God is either here or he's not, based on whether he presents himself to us. But this is the way we view things, and it certainly is not to say that we can't find very strong evidence and things that point towards there being a God. And by the way, also, I think, as I say, nothing is absolutely certain. I think it's very reasonable, plausible, perhaps even beyond a reasonable doubt to say that there is a non-physical being that created the world, that's involved in the world, because of the reasons I laid out. But ultimately, every decision in life, there's going to be arguments either way, because nothing is absolutely certain. Yes, some things are more certain than others, but life is always about choosing between things. And for me, there's so much that points towards there being a God. I can't kind of say it's 100%, perhaps not, but there's so much that's there. So for me, I feel like that's enough. And so I think that the test of needing 100% bulletproof, I don't think that's reasonable, and I don't think you can expect that of anything in life.
Myself, my own sense of despair, particularly looking at it from a perspective of mental health issues and addiction, is that there is an unaddressed yearning for a kind of oneness, togetherness, and like, to your point earlier about Brent, indeed for love. And when you talk about that sense of awe, of like the appreciation of an animal, the love of an animal, and the sort of regard and gratitude for having an animal love you and care for you, or the beauty of nature, or the deep, deep beauty of the cosmos, what I feel like, and my own appreciation, understanding, stroke, belief in God is that there is a kind of, in the love of it, in the awareness of rightness itself, there is an indication that there is such a thing as rightness. Not that any one particular group or ideology has unique, a particular and special access to it. And I really firmly, deeply believe that spirituality is for me, not for me to tell other people,
So yes, I think this is actually the most important point that Russell Brand makes in the whole interview, which is that rightness is inherent. Like, the fact that we all seem to recognise this, all of us recognise certain things are true, that you can't just abuse an innocent person, you can't just kill someone, murder someone, an innocent person. It's just not. We all seem to agree on that. And also, when we spoke about spiritual experiences, a sense of love that people feel between two people, they feel a transcendent experience. This sense of awe when looking up at the stars. There is something that where but particularly when it comes to morals, there's something which we all seem to recognise, that there's something absolute, something transcendent about these things. We fight. We're prepared to fight and get angry over it when we hear people say things that certain things, if they were to object to this, or to argue that somehow we should ignore the moral impulse within us. But we wouldn't have that same level of argument and frustration over arguing over what's the best flavour of ice cream out there. It's so clearly something that we believe transcends space and time, really, and just this moment in history that we're living in, the question of basic morals. There's a great quote by Bertrand Russell, who is an atheist, and he said, quote, "I cannot see how to refute the arguments for the subjectivity of ethical values, but I find myself incapable of believing that all that is wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it." And he's touching on this very point. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to him that it seems so inherent in every single human being. Why is that? This is called the moral argument, and it points towards there being a God. Let's keep going.
In the Bible, it says you should pray secretly.
Okay, Ricky, don't get all Bible expert with us now. I don't actually know where you're referring to in the Bible that says that. I'm not really sure. It could be the New Testament, maybe. I'm not sure. But there's certainly, I think there's a value both towards communal prayer and private prayer. Communal spiritual experiences, whether it's in secular terms like at a concert or something like that, I'm sure you can understand that it has value, doing things as a group as well as an individual. So obviously, if there is such a thing as spirituality, especially religion, it makes sense that religion would want to organise in a way that they can have communal experiences of love, transcendence, spirituality, prayer, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there is something sort of deeply private about it, but like I do feel like when people think there's no purpose or meaning, that and that needn't necessarily be just because of a belief in God, that it creates cultures that are oddly materialistic, nihilistic. And I feel like in the last 20 years we're seeing more and more worship of self, worship of individual.
Well, of course, there's a new narcissism, of course, and I don't know why I think social media is.
Well, I think atheism's partly to blame. Again, I'm not saying that to be good or bad is entirely based on your being religious or not religious, but I am saying, yes, if you don't believe that there's that there's no the source of existence, there is no source of existence, then the only real sort of center of existence is going to be yourself and your own experience of it. If you believe in a God, or you think there's enough sufficient evidence, in my case, that there's a God, and you subscribe to that and live a life by that, then you acknowledge that there's also something beyond you, and an existence and a consciousness beyond you that you can have a relationship with, but also think about, it's humbling in a sense to recognize that, and it also. Yes, I think it makes you more conscious of your actions, and it makes you less self-centered, because the second that you acknowledge that there is a being that created you, that there is a purpose to your life, and that life has meaning, and the most important thing is that you lead a good and ethical life, because that will have an infinite consequences, whereas you believe it will have no consequences ultimately, as the whole world will eventually become, fade away into nothingness. Then I think it probably does create a culture in society that becomes happier, more giving, oriented towards doing good to others, helping others, happier because they feel like life has a purpose and meaning. I'm not saying this is what makes religion true necessarily, but this is a discussion about pragmatism now, about whether an atheist or a religious society leads to, what you're talking about, nihilism and self-centeredness. So yeah, absolutely. I think an atheist secular society, not talking about the government, but I'm talking about the society. If the society is secular and atheist in terms of their values and beliefs, I think yes, it does lead to a lot of self-centeredness, because you become the center of the universe. There is no other great consciousness that's greater than you in terms of having authority or a say over your existence.
I do think there's people crave a oneness, even if we don't know about understanding about why we're here, because again, that's very human. We're inquisitive. We want to know why. We want the answer why. And some people don't accept. Well, we don't know yet, but we're on the way. They go, no. Well, there's no, the God of the gaps. We understand that. Well, if you don't know, explain it. God did it. Okay, well, it doesn't really solve anything. Even down to I put a joke in Afterlife where Kat's bothering me, and she says, "Where did it all come from? Someone from nothing." And I go, "Well, where did it all come from then?" She goes, "God made it." I go, "Okay, where did God come from?" She went, "He's always been around." I go, "Simple as that, isn't it?"
Okay, I'm not actually sure I follow you here. Something from something is a lot more scientifically palatable than something from nothing. We haven't found an answer to that yet, that question. That's a huge question right now. And I'm saying it's much more reasonable to say that something created something, but because we know that there was a beginning to the physical something, therefore something non-physical had to cause that physical something to begin. So I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say there, but this whole thing in terms of God of the gaps, well, I'm saying right now, in terms of what science tells us about the beginning of the universe, in terms of the design of the universe, making it so acceptable for human life, to me that's logical, that's pointing towards there being an infinite creator and designer. And in terms of the whole God of the gaps thing, I mean, yes, it might be that there are some people who say we can't explain this yet and therefore God, or therefore not God. I mean, sometimes things can't be explained and therefore it's reasonable to posit an infinite being, like, for example, the beginning of the universe. But other things, you're right, we're not sure what the answer is right now. You're right, and we might not have to point towards designer or creator. So I think that's a bit of a neutral point. I mean, some people do that God of the Gaps thing, and it's not, necessary. Fine, but okay, we can agree on that. But I think there's plenty of things that do point towards God. One time in which people do talk about God of the Gaps is the issue of evolution and the unanswered question of, well, how did that very first being that was so complex in order to have RNA or DNA within it, that's so complex in and of itself. Bill Gates described it as being more complex than the most complicated computer that he could design, and that came from inanimate matter. How did that first cell, which is much harder to get from inanimate matter to that very first cell than all the other stages of reproduction and development in evolution, and we don't have an answer to that question yet. The first cell. How did that happen? Now, some people can say, therefore God. Some people say, no, we just have an answer to that question. I think it's a neutral point. Okay, we don't have an answer to that. I think for some people, it's sort of encouraging them in terms of saying, well, you need. It's so absurd to see how this could happen that it therefore points towards a creator, but I don't think we have to go that far and discuss that. I think there are some very clear, real things that we can discuss right here, right now, that we know about in terms of the universe having a beginning, in terms of the intricate design of the universe, that I think points towards an infinite creator and designer.
So, it doesn't answer the question, but I get it, and I think, apart from people wanting there to be some sort of divine justice, because that would be great. Good people would be rewarded and bad people would be punished. Brilliant. Okay, it doesn't work like that. You only have to look at children in Africa being born with cancer, and we know that's not. We know mysterious ways isn't an explanation. Okay.
Well, my gosh, this is really going into a very deep subject. I mean, I don't like the way in which he's just like, we know that's not an answer. We know. Let's discuss it a little bit. It's not. I think Science presents things as if they're just so straightforward, but actually there's not. There's a lot of depth to these discussions. Theodicy, the question of how there can be suffering in the world if there's a God. This is a big discussion. We have a video on this, well, several videos on this on JTV, but one that I think our viewers will find really useful. I'm going to put a description in the link below on the question of if there's a God, how can there be suffering? But there's a few points that I'd make. First of all, the question of mysterious ways. I suppose one analogy that's given, I don't like the use of this term, God works in mysterious ways, but I think you do have to acknowledge that just as a child, when they're 2 years old and they're taken to a hospital to have an injection, and they look at their mother thinking they're being betrayed as this doctor puts this needle into their arm and they're screaming and crying and upset with the parent, so too, if you do accept the notion that there's a God, then the idea that we could have the same level of knowledge and understanding as our Father in heaven, an infinite being, is absurd. And to be able to fully comprehend the entire landscape of the whole story of human history and why things have to happen in certain ways, we are like the child in that sense. That's certainly one way of looking at it, and I think that's what people mean when they talk about mysterious ways. But I think the other thing to recognise is, yes, that how could there possibly be an explanation to, young people dying or all kinds of terrible suffering that we see? Well, yeah, we as Jews don't believe that we can have all the answers in this world, and our job is actually not to figure out why everything happens, but to respond as best we can to making the world as good as we can, and to use, not to be able to know why things happen, but to say, okay, what can I do with what's happened to make the world as good as possible? By the way, if the world was entirely perfect, perhaps we would have no purpose. Perhaps there'd be nothing for us to do. Perhaps there'd be nowhere in which we could be partners with God in perfecting the world. But also, we do believe that, yes, actually, just as we do believe that suffering can have a purpose, and we might not be able to make sense of it fully in this world, but we can. The second that you acknowledge that there's a world beyond this world, that there is an eternal afterlife, then I do think that dramatically changes things. It might not be able to explain why things happen, but if you believe there is ultimately an eternal existence, then that means that any finite amount of suffering is only finite and will lead to it does lead to an eternal resting space or an eternal joy, comfort, serenity, then I think that changes things dramatically. But of course, it's exceptionally difficult to make sense of things, and that in no way is meant to put us at ease with the suffering in the world. It's the opposite. That's why we don't really like to talk too much about. We don't try and search for answers on why bad things happen. It does happen to be, though, that occasionally, well, not even occasionally, sometimes we can see, not always, but sometimes we can see how suffering can have positive results in this world. And when I say suffering, I mean people going through some level of pain, exertion, challenge, difficulty. There's no doubt that oftentimes makes people become people of substance. It makes them ask the big questions about their lives. What am I really living for? What's life all about? We know whether it's even just going to the gym, we know that suffering, pain, exertion leads to rewards. I believe that actually, ultimately, if someone goes through some terrible suffering, I think that as much as we find it hard to hear that there was an ultimate purpose behind this. Not that the suffering is good in and of itself, but it will lead to an ultimate good end, good reward, good final outcome. Perhaps not even in this world. But I actually think that people would much rather know that their suffering and the things they're experiencing in their life has meaning, has an ultimate purpose, than it was just an accident and there's no reason for it and it's all meaningless. It's hard to hear that you're saying, we don't like hearing that because what an all-loving, all-powerful God would do this to me? But actually, delve a little bit deeper, reflect a little bit more, and you'll recognise that it's actually harder to swallow to say that this was all for nothing. So, anyway, let's keep going.
I think we think that, hold on, well, it's too good. It's too good to be chance. Everything's perfect. Well, it seems that way. It's like Douglas Adams' puddle, when it imagines this, I fit this hole perfectly.
Well, yes, this is the other point that I said we were going to talk about a bit later, which is the design argument about the world. The fact that it's so clearly designed for human life. It's like what some people call the Goldilocks zone. It's just right for human existence. Whether it's the distance between the Earth to the Sun, if we were just a little bit closer, it would be too hot. If we were a little bit further away, we'd all freeze to death. Whether it's the way the Earth spins on its axis and the different seasons that we can experience. Whether it's other things like the fact that water, unlike all other liquids, starts by, when it freezes, when it gets below 0 degrees Celsius, it freezes from the top rather from the bottom, which allows for sea life to continue to exist. All these things, it seems like the universe is made for human life. And by the way, it's not just that it's made for human life to exist, but there's so much beauty beyond just that we can live, but there's so much beauty within life. Colours, beautiful flowers, different foods. It's not just that all we can eat is like dirt to feed us that would sustain us. It's like all these beautiful foods and things, and so much else. Now, some people would say, as I'm sure Ricky will do, he'll say, well, we just got lucky. We're the universe that got lucky. There's infinite amounts of universes, and we're in the universe that where all things are right. So of course we're going to say, well, it's all great. Yeah, this clearly points towards a God. But the problem with this, Ricky, is that what is the scientific evidence for there being an infinite amount of universes, a multiverse? There's nothing. Zero. There's no evidence whatsoever for that. By definition, we cannot perceive or observe anything outside of our universe, and therefore to say that there's infinite amounts of universes, you're taking just as much of a leap of faith, if not, I would say more, than someone who would say this points towards design. In the same way that any complex structures that we see existing in the world, we say, well, this clearly had a designer. But you're saying except nature, that doesn't apply. So I don't know. I think if anyone's jumping on the faith bandwagon in terms of believing in there being infinite universes, it's you.
You're right. We are scared and alone, and the idea of death is horrible. What, you'll never exist again? What was the point? And again, I talk about this in Afterlife 1, where I say, Kath's saying that if you think it's, there's no heaven, why don't you kill yourself? And I say, so if you're watching a really good film, but you know it's going to end, you might as well just stop it. She went, no, because I'm going to watch it again. And I say, I think that's the amazing thing about life. You can't watch it again. One day you'll hug, your mum for the last time. You'll smell your last flower. You'll eat your last meal. You won't know it's your last, but it will be your last. And so you've got to make the most of everything. And it is a terrifying prospect. It is like sad that we'll never exist again, I think. But it doesn't mean it's not true. The bottom line is, I can't believe something I don't believe.
Well, this is very honest of Ricky to say this. And again, Bertrand Russell, a famed atheist, said, quote, "We must build our lives in the firm foundation of despair." And as William Lane Craig, a Christian philosopher, argued, he said that atheists have to basically choose between being happy or being consistent. Because ultimately, he says it is depressing. And yes, it is depressing to say that ultimately our existence doesn't continue in any way, and there is no ultimate purpose to life, and there is no ultimate infinite eternity that's built as a result of the actions that we do in our short lifespan. For religious people, you can live a life that's both happy and consistent. For atheists, it's just not possible. I'm not saying this makes religion or atheism true or not true, but it certainly is true that life is meaningless if there is no purpose for creation. I mean, it's just obvious. If there's no purpose for creation, then life is an accident, and ultimately everything in the physical world will decay and there's nothing beyond the physical world, then it is meaningless. There is no meaning behind it. And Ricky's going to start talking about, how he can make his own meaning now, but I don't think it's consistent with what he believes. So let's see what he says.
And so how do I find meaning? Well, we are here. The chances of us being us, you being you and me being me, existing now, that sperm hitting that egg is 400 trillion to 1. We're not special, but we are lucky. We do exist. It's incredible. And I think of it, it's like a holiday. We don't exist for 13.5 billion years. Then we explode into this this electronic blob of thought, introspection, love, hate, fear, beauty, horror, for 80, 90, 100 years if we're lucky. Then we die and we never exist again. We return, our atoms return, and it carries on, right? And that's not scary.
I just want to pick up on one thing he said there, by the way, which is that he said, I am so lucky. I feel so lucky that I'm here. I think it's interesting to note, by the way, that as a religious person, I would use the word I'm blessed. I think that's something we spoke about earlier in terms of gratitude, and I think that's one difference in terms of gratitude between a religious person and an atheist person. You can both experience gratitude, but I feel blessed that this has been given to me by a being, whereas he feels lucky because this was all an accident. And I think there is, if you think about the difference between those two words, feeling blessed and being able to express that to a being, as opposed to just feeling lucky but not being able to express that to anyone beyond yourself, I think there is a qualitative difference there in terms of how that can make one feel and how they'd lead their life. But let's continue to hear what he's saying on this point about, life having no meaning, but now he's going to talk about making meaning for himself. And he's saying that it's not scary that our life will disintegrate into nothingness and there's nothing beyond the physical world. I think that is scary. I think that is very depressing, as he was just seemed to be saying a little bit earlier.
Because I think people are scared of death because they don't know what's beyond. And someone said to me, well, what do you think it feels like when you die? And I say, like the 13.5 billion years before I was born. And that was all right. So, but the big thing is injecting meaning.
Just want to pause there for a sec, by the way. As religious Jews believe that we did have a consciousness before we were brought into this world, but it's been wiped out of our brains, our consciousness, because obviously if we did have experience of that, then it would be the same as God revealing himself to us. We'd know there's a spiritual world, so clearly it would be almost empirical. We've spoken about that a little bit before. But yes, I just thought that point would be worth adding in terms of the Jewish perspective on that.
I think you're totally right. I think you're totally right. When you start thinking about it, why are we here? Well, I mean, not even the how, but why. Well, to live your life to the fullest and not hurt anyone, to leave the world in a better place than it was when you came into it, to experience everything, all the reasons, all the obvious reasons, you know, love, wine, dogs, learning, all these great things that you can do every minute of every day that you're alive, and then you check out. You go, I'm done, thanks, and it's done, and it's beautiful.
Okay, so you're saying that you'll make meaning for yourself in life, even though life is ultimately meaningless. You'll make meaning for yourself because you'll be good to other people and you'll do, you know, you'll give and you'll love. But you're saying that will give you meaning. But according to who, Ricky? According to who says that's meaningful? You're saying it's meaningful. Why does that fill you with meaning? Why is it something, you're saying we all know it. Why do we all know it? First, the first reason I'm asking that is because the fact that we all seem to acknowledge this points towards some kind of infinite transcendence, absolute reality and truth that we all seem to recognize, which points towards something beyond the physical world. But also, I'm saying that it's not coherent to say that life is meaningless and yet you're going to do something which you believe will give you a sense of, you know, meaning when there is no meaning. And also beyond the basic stuff of killing for no reason, all that kind of stuff that we spoke about, knowing that that's important, other stuff, reason doesn't necessarily make you a moral person or something, or find morals that we're all going to agree upon. Ultimately, according to your logic, if one person lives a good life and someone else leads a bad life, what happens in the end to both of them is the same, nothingness. There is no ultimate consequence to their action. And as Kai Nielsen, an atheist philosopher, said, he said, pure practical reason will not take you to morality. It might be that we have a moral impulse within us, but plenty of people throughout society have rejected that moral impulse because there might not be a good reason to do it, unless you acknowledge that the reason why you feel this way is because there is an absolute meaning and absolute transcendence. So I think we both agree that it's meaningful to give and to help people and to love and, you know, to lead a life of goodness. But what determines what that goodness is and why? Why is that meaningful, Ricky? Why is that meaningful to you? That's the question that I feel like you're not really answering here.
It is beautiful. But I was struck when you said that by a few things. One is like this sort of like the injection of meaning, as in, you know, like meaning would have to be imported externally, fabricated somehow, invented. Whereas I think on some level I feel that that meaning is inhered.
Yep. Thank you very much, Russell Brand. This is the key. This is, I feel like, the only real main important point that he's making in this interview. And yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. It's something we all seem to agree upon. Meaning is inherent to all of us.
The fact that we don't understand, you know, the mind-body problem completely yet, that is the beauty. And the more we understand, the more questions it throws up. It's amazing what intelligence is.
It happens to be, by the way, the question of consciousness and the question of how we're actually experiencing reality, and so many unanswered questions around that. Many people are saying this points towards some kind of non-physical dimension. You know, what is consciousness? How do we explain the mind-body connection? There are so many unanswered questions. And I think his boldness in asserting that the physical, you know, materialism, that's all there is, when there are so many unanswered questions in this realm, and to say that, you know, that consciousness only exists within the physical realm, it just seems to me somewhat sort of dogmatic. Oh, don't think you like that word, Ricky.
No, I'm a determinist, which changes nothing. I believe that free will is an illusion. So be it. If it feels like it, it might as well be. But then to analyse it and go, well, we're machines.
Okay, so it happens to be that this is an important sort of pillar of atheist philosophy, believing that indeterminism, that ultimately free will is an illusion. And he says, well, it feels like we sort of have free will, so we might as well. This sort of reminds me of the previous quote that I said, which is pure practical reason doesn't take you to morality, according to that atheist philosopher. And pure practical reason on the part of an atheist that believes in determinism, that ultimately the way we act is just a result of our chemical biological makeup. I think that if you are completely intellectually honest, it's extremely, extremely dangerous to go down that path. How can we ultimately be accountable? How can anyone be accountable? How can you hold people in relationships accountable if the way they're acting is predetermined? How can we hold criminals accountable? You might say that, oh, well, for pragmatic reasons, let's just act as if we hold people accountable. But if ideas have power and resonance, and people might take this idea to its ultimate end eventually, which is to stop holding people accountable. And then what happens to relationships? And then what happens to society? Then what happens to the criminal justice system? Now, this is a pragmatic argument, and I'm saying a pragmatic reason why we need to believe and accept that we human beings have agency, have free will. But I'm not necessarily making a case here for the argument to prove that we have free will. I'm saying why it's important to believe that we have. And people that believe in religion, that human beings have agency, have moral agency, have the ability to make free will decisions in the realm of morality, it's so important to recognise the implications of this. And I feel like Ricky isn't really being serious about those implications. He's sort of just gliding over them. And the reason why I believe we have free will is because it's a two-step process. The first step is because I think there's convincing evidence, compelling evidence for there being a God and the Torah is a divinely authored book. And therefore, because I believe, and Jews believe, and monotheists believe that there is a God that gave us moral agency, and that there is a purpose to our life, and we have to make choices to fulfill that purpose and make the best of our lives. That's why we believe, and because also God tells us we have free will. He says choose these things, do these things, implying that we have the ability to choose between the two, and that there is a sort of a level playing field. I think that's why we believe, and I believe in free will. So yeah, I think it's a very, very dangerous path to go down, Ricky, when you say that, just generally in atheistic society, but here when you say that there is no free will. Very dangerous path to go down.
We're lumps of meat. We're chimps with brains the size of a planet. Of course we go mad and try and kill each other and worry about what's the point. Of course we do. It's overwhelming. And the more you think about it, the more frightening it is.
I feel like we discussed this a little bit earlier, but I mean, we can't go inside the minds of animals, but do they deal with the same kind of ethical, moral dilemmas, same kind of desperation for meaning in their lives that human beings have? You're saying we're just like animals, we're just lumps of flesh just like animals. Are they grappling with those same things? It seems like their main things are just, need for food and sex, basically. But human beings, if they just had those two things, they would be miserable. Human beings seem to need meaning. And that points towards there being some kind of meaning, transcendence beyond the physical world. And so, you're both saying, on the one hand, we're nothing more than animals, but on the other hand, you're saying, I want to behave morally, which other animals don't think they need to do. And you're saying that you do feel depressed when you say there is no meaning, recognizing that you have this inherent desire and need for meaning. So you don't seem to be very consistent.
Nature is super enough. We don't need angels and unicorns. And then I go into, we don't need to look. I feel we don't need to look elsewhere. That doesn't mean I'm not in awe of poetry and intelligence. And, I just don't think that unweaving the rainbow spoils it.
Hold on, religion isn't unweaving the rainbow. The scientific revolution that occurred in the 1600s and 1700s all these people, you know, thinking Newton, Isaac Newton, these were religious people. They believed that because God designed the universe, there's a way to make sense of the universe. And the scientific revolution was led by religious people who said, no, we should understand the universe, and that will help us to be in awe of God. So in no way are we a religious, well, some religious people are, but I don't believe it's the right approach as a religious person to be anti-science or anti-trying to understand the world. Actually, quite the opposite.
When I see a card trick and I don't know how it's done, and then the magician tells me, I can't wait for him to show someone else who doesn't know how it's done. And how it's done is more exciting for me. And that's all I think. The fact that I don't understand something doesn't mean it's not understandable. I wouldn't be so arrogant as to think that because I don't understand consciousness and the fact that the universe is expanding, it doesn't mean it's not true.
Hold on, I don't follow what you're saying here. You don't understand something, and yet you're saying you don't understand consciousness. You don't understand something from nothing, but therefore you're going to boldly say no evidence, nothing points towards. There's no reason to even indulge in the possibility of there being something beyond the physical world. I don't get what you're saying here. It seems to be like confused thinking.
So I think I've always got that get out clause. I don't have to leap for a being did it, a different being on a different plane and level made.
Yeah, but Rookie, you're making leaps by saying that there's infinite universes and you can get something from nothing. Those are leaps as well. So to say that it's like you're on the one hand saying, well, I've got the answers, but on the other hand, you're saying I don't have the answers. It feels like muddled thinking to me.
And I think that most people would be satisfied if you sat them down and said, all those things that you think God did, right? He did. He just doesn't have a will like you think he does. He's just nature.
Yes.
And I think some people would be happy with that.
Okay, well, I feel like we've kind of discussed this a lot, but I'm saying both from a logical point of view, there is reason to say that there is a God that created the natural world and the physical universe. You're saying people will be satisfied without it. From not just, that's the logical thing, but from the people being satisfied point of view, and from like the pragmatic point of view, and like how that makes us feel. I've just explained to you how the damaging effects, whether it's from not believing we have free will, whether it's from believing that we are the centers of existence, whether it's believing that life has no meaning, all these things, I don't think people would be satisfied with, or at least I think it would make them depressed. I think it would give their lives no meaning, and I think it would have very, very serious and damaging consequences for society.
Another point. Again, I put it in Afterlife as a bit of a joke, where Kath says to me, if you don't believe in God and heaven and all that, why don't you just go out raping and murdering as much as you want? And I say, I do, which is not at all. And that's a scary prospect that some people, because they think in absolute morality, they think that there's no point in being good without a God. And that's quite a big school of thought that people take that to the nth degree. That go, and my worry is that if you're only not murdering because you think God's watching, that's scary.
Yeah, like it's the purge.
Okay, so again, I don't think we have much to say here because we've discussed a lot of this already. But yes, as we've said, there are certain morals that are inherent to all of us. No, I think people that say, oh, well, I'd need a God to tell me that murder's wrong. No, it's every society in history has said that murder for no reason whatsoever is wrong, unless and what they have to do is they have to present a reason why it's okay to kill these specific people, or to say why we should ignore that moral impulse within us. So people that say that, I just don't think they're being intellectually honest to say that I have no moral compass whatsoever. But beyond that, beyond the basics, when it comes to more detailed ethics, when it comes to more detailed building relationships, especially with God, we do need these things. And also the fact that you're saying you need a God to tell you that this is true. Well, you're saying it's so obvious to me. Again, Ricky, why is it so obvious to you? Why is it so obvious to every single human being that these basic morals are true? That is what points towards what Russell Brand is saying. It points towards a transcendent existence, reality that we all can touch upon, that we all recognise is meaningful. There is meaning there, that this is not all an accident, that this is not all meaningless. And again, I also think you're consistently underestimating, we'll talk about this in the very last point that you say, you're underestimating the power of Judeo and Judeo-Christian values in the way that they've impacted so much of the morals and values that we take for granted today, beyond those basic ones which we spoke about.
So, yeah, I don't believe in absolute morality, because I think that we invented morality as a code to live by so we could all be as happy as possible. There are different laws for different times and different species. You know, the law of the spider is not the same as the law as the human. We know that. If I'm starving, I don't eat my own legs, and when we don't bite the head of the partner afterwards. So it's a nonsense to try and equate morality with nature and spirituality and religion. It is because people got together and decided that the best way to live. You know, that's society.
Again, this is just such muddled thinking, Ricky, because like on the one hand, you're saying that you just said at the beginning, I don't believe in absolute morality. You know, it's society that figures these things out. But on the other hand, you're saying there are some things which we don't need religion to tell us. We should just know automatically. And these are things which are inherent. But the question is, why are they inherent in all of us? They're not inherent in other species. And you're saying, well, we're different to other species. Well, why do we act differently to other species? Why do we not believe in the law of the jungle as every other species does? And you're saying also that society is, you know, it's up to societies alone to figure out, the basics. But there's plenty of societies, whether it's ancient or modern, which have done terrible things because they've said that morality they've justified through other kinds of rationale. Why they've justified why you can some morals don't apply to certain situations, or that murder or killing can apply to certain humans that are going to, they believe, damage society or are sort of non-human or less than human. And so there's this muddled thinking. On the one hand, you're saying we don't need absolute morality, society can figure it out, even though so many times society is really messed up. But on the other hand, you're saying there are these things that we all just know it's moral, but like, why do we know it's moral? And it sounds like you're saying we all know it's moral, that means it's absolute. So it seems like very muddled thinking to me. But let's get to your final point, because this is a new point that I want to raise in this discussion.
So, yeah, I don't believe in absolute morality, because I think that we invented morality as a code to live by so we could all be as happy as possible.
Let me just stop there for a second. You said we invented it so we could all be as happy as possible, but people's definition of how morality should apply has been so different depending on different cultures, and how we should relate to those basic moral impulses that we have. So it's just you're making it sound so straightforward, like every society can just figure it out. That has not been what history has taught us.
And the irony is that a secular society would defend all rights to religious belief more than any one religion does. But all it's saying is, let's not make it law, let's not make superstition law, let's not...
Okay, so this is the final point I want to raise. Now, I think, Ricky, you are not acknowledging that the secular Western societies that we're living in, where do they get their values of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all human beings having certain dignities, rights, and freedoms that they should all be able to have? Where does that come from? I can't see where else you could argue it comes from other than from the Judeo-Christian teachings and values, more specifically the Hebrew Bible. If you look at the big movers and shakers within the Enlightenment movement, which led to the democratic West, they base so much of their philosophy of separation of church and state, of certain freedoms and rights, on religious principles. They actually based secular government as separating church and state on religious principles. Certainly in Britain and America, if you look at the American Declaration of Independence, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." The founders of America said that because there's a God, we all have inherent value. All human beings have the right to pursue a life without interference from government, and that's what led them to believe in and argue for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all the other freedoms that exist in the democratic West. And if you look actually at the French and Russian revolutions, which were based on more atheistic philosophies, they ended in blood and tyranny. So actually, I think there's no acknowledgement whatsoever of the fact that how we got to this place of secular governments granting, separating church and state and granting rights to people came from the concepts found within the Hebrew Bible. Whether it's the founding fathers were very interested in the fact that the Hebrew Bible encourages separating the power of the king from the power of the priests and separating church and state in that regard. Also, the fact that the king had to have a Torah scroll with him at all times to imply that he was held to the rule of law just as everyone else is. But also, yes, in Europe, several hundred years ago, there was theocracy. You did have church and state often blended, and that was considered bad. But the way we got out of that was by many Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers returning to the texts of a fascination actually with the Hebrew Bible, where it said, and they were more, that was part of the Protestant Reformation and movement, which was saying, let's start reading the Bible again and looking at what it has to say about human beings having rights, freedoms, social responsibilities towards one another, and the importance of recognizing that dignity. And one of the things that led to was the importance of recognizing the importance of separating church and state. So the very secular society and separation of church and state, which you applaud so much and commend, came about only through religious principles. And actually, if you look at some of the big secular atheistic movements that happened to be atheistic over the last 100 years in the 20th century, they were all bloody, and they were all they killed tens or hundreds of millions. So I think we can certainly agree that from the perspective of government, it's good to have, at this stage in our history, to have a separation of religion and politics. But number one, how do we get to that stage? What are those values predicated on? And yes, you're right, also there have been some atheistic movements that have also justified separating church and state. But I'm saying I think the most successful applications of it have come from religion, and also I'm saying that religion can argue for it. But the other thing that I really have tried to argue throughout this whole video is that put government to one side, I'm talking about society. And if you don't have a society that has certain religious values and ethics, I think it's going to lead to despair, to nihilism, and to potentially, yes, to societies that become morally degraded. And sadly, I think we're starting to see some of the results of that in the secularized West today. And Ricky and Russell, I don't know if you're ever going to watch this video. I hope our viewers will. I hope this will get seen by as many people as possible. That's in some ways is actually more important. But I just think there needs to be a bit more of a recognition of these kind of issues and to grapple with them, because you're making it sound as if it's all very straightforward, and it actually really isn't. The issues are more complex than you're presenting them. And I think I've tried to argue that from a religious perspective, certainly from a Jewish religious monotheistic perspective, both from a consistent point of view and from a pragmatic point of view, in terms of creating the best possible society, and also in terms of creating the most content and happy society. From that perspective, I think I've argued that monotheism does have answers to those things, and can be logical, coherent, rational, and also give people meaning and give people happiness. So yeah, that's the end of my rant, and perhaps, I don't know, if you guys like this, please just comment below and let me know what you think of this, and maybe we'll do some more of these in the future. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube, and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button and under Following, click See First. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.